We've all experienced those seemingly endless road trips, haven't we? The kind that test your endurance and patience as the miles blur together. You know the scenario. Hours on the highway, eyes fixed on the road, as you wrestle with that familiar dilemma. Can I hold out for another 20 minutes, or do I need to stop now before it's too late? Sometimes luck is on your side, and you find a rest stop that feels like an oasis. These are the ones with everything you could want. Clean restrooms, a gas station, maybe even a food court or a convenience store stocked with snacks to keep you going. But if you've traveled enough, you know these gems are few and far between. Most of the time, especially in those remote stretches of highway, you're left with the bare essentials. A tiny building, barely big enough for a couple of restrooms, and perhaps an old vending machine if you're fortunate. That was exactly the kind of trip I was on, a grueling 15-hour drive that felt like it would never end. The journey spanned through the night, making it even more exhausting. I'll spare you the exact details of where I was coming from and where I was headed, but let's just say it was somewhere along the lonely, desolate eastern seaboard of the United States. The landscape around me felt almost abandoned, and the road itself seemed forgotten by time. There weren't many other cars on the highway. In fact, hours could go by without me spotting a single vehicle. When I did, it was so rare that it almost felt like a small event, a reminder that I wasn't entirely alone out there in the darkness. As the night dragged on, the fatigue started to catch up with me. My body was stiff from sitting too long, my legs felt restless, and worst of all, the pressure to find a bathroom was mounting. It wasn't just a mild discomfort anymore. I needed to stop. I kept scanning the road ahead, searching for those familiar blue highway signs that signal a rest area. Each mile without one made the need feel more urgent, like time itself was running out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A sign for a rest stop up ahead. That little blue rectangle felt like a beacon of hope, a promise of relief after hours of holding out. A few minutes later, I veered off the highway and into the small parking lot of the rest area. It wasn't one of those fancy stops with all the amenities. No, this was as basic as they come. A single modest restroom building stood in the middle of the lot, illuminated by a dim, flickering light. There wasn't much else to it. No convenience store, no bustling activity, just silence and emptiness. But at that moment, it was all I needed. Minimal, yes, but sufficient enough to offer a brief reprieve from the endless monotony of the road. There was just one other car in the rest stop's small, dimly lit parking lot, parked a short distance away from mine. It was an unremarkable vehicle, the kind you'd barely notice in passing, but something about it caught my eye. The windows were heavily tinted, dark enough that I couldn't make out whether anyone was inside. My gaze lingered for a moment, more out of idle curiosity than concern, before I shook off the thought. I figured someone might be napping inside, a common sight at these rest areas. Still, an inexplicable sense of unease began to creep over me, subtle at first but growing as I stood there. I stepped out of my car and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my legs from hours of driving. The night air was cool and carried a faint smell of damp asphalt, but it did little to calm the unsettled feeling in my gut. It wasn't as though anything specific had happened, just a strange tension, like something unseen was pressing against the edges of my awareness. I dismissed it as road weariness and made my way toward the restroom building, the glow from its flickering light casting erratic shadows across the lot. The moment I entered the restroom, though, I knew something wasn't right. A palpable unease hung in the air, thick and oppressive. My eyes immediately went to the far corner of the room, where I saw a figure, a man, standing motionless. His back was to me, his head bowed as if he were staring at something on the floor. At first, I assumed he was using one of the urinals, but something about his posture seemed off. A closer glance confirmed my suspicion. He wasn't even near the fixtures. He was just standing there, facing the corner of the wall in a way that felt both unnatural and deeply unsettling. I froze for a moment, my thoughts racing. Should I say something? Ask if he was okay? The idea of speaking up seemed both rational and terrifying. The room was dead silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights, and the stillness made the situation feel even more bizarre. The air itself felt heavy, almost suffocating, as though the space was holding its breath. Deciding to avoid any interaction, I moved toward one of the stalls. My steps were slow and deliberate, the sound of my shoes against the tile unnervingly loud in the otherwise quiet room. I slipped inside a stall and locked the door, But even the act of closing myself off didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it heightened my anxiety. Inside the stall, I tried to focus on my initial reason for stopping, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The tension in the room was impossible to ignore, and my mind was racing with every worst-case scenario I could imagine. Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, unable to relax. Eventually, I gave up. Flushing the toilet out of reflex, I steeled myself and stepped out of the stall. That's when I saw him again. He had turned around. He was still in the same spot, but now his face was visible, and it was wrong. That's the only word I can use to describe it. His eyes were sunken and hollow, his skin pallid, and his expression was eerily blank, as if he were looking at me without really seeing me. Yet there was something in his gaze that chilled me to my core. It wasn't just unsettling, it was unnatural. I didn't wait to find out more. My heart was pounding, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Without a word, I bolted for the door, barely able to think beyond the primal urge to get out. I burst into the parking lot and raced to my car, my hands fumbling as I started the engine. As I drove away, my chest still tight with fear, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man was outside now, standing in the lot, watching me as I sped off into the night. As I started the engine, I caught sight of him in my rearview mirror. He was walking toward me. My instincts took over, and I sped out of the lot, barely giving myself time to breathe as I merged back onto the highway. 20 minutes later, I spotted another rest area. By now, the urgency to use the bathroom was impossible to ignore. This stop was nearly identical to the first, but it was completely empty, a small relief. I parked close to the restroom building, hurried inside, and finally let myself relax in a stall. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't the casual kind that stop at a urinal. No, these steps came directly to my stall and halted right outside the door. I glanced down and saw a pair of shoes through the gap beneath the door. My stomach sank. Was it him? Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I managed to say, "Someone's in here." Silence. My words seemed to evaporate into the air. Panic gripped me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, putting the call on speaker so the intruder could hear the operator. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end. I spoke loudly, making it clear I wasn't alone. I'm being followed. I feel threatened by someone. That did it. Whoever was outside turned and walked away. I stayed in the stall, trembling, until a knock at the restroom door signaled the arrival of the police. After describing the man and recounting the events, the officer assured me they'd patrol the area. We inspected my car. No signs of tampering. The officer even followed me back onto the highway for a while, ensuring I felt safe before he turned off at an exit. The rest of my trip passed without incident, but that night left a lasting mark. I'm certain the man at the second stop was the same unsettling figure from the first. And the fact that this could happen to anyone, even someone like me, was the most terrifying part of all. If this story gave you chills and left you looking over your shoulder, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your reactions. Your feedback means the world to us. And if you haven't already, consider supporting the channel by hitting that subscribe button. It's completely free, but it makes a huge difference in helping us continue to bring you more spine-tingling tales, eerie mysteries, and unforgettable scares.